On today's episode of Apostolic Life in the 21st Century, we are going to talk about a very important scriptural principle, and that principle is modesty. Dr. David K. Bernard is with us today. He's the author of 2 books on holiness, In Search of Holiness and Practical Holiness, and we're going to talk about this concept of modesty and how we apply it to our lives here in the 21st century. Dr. Bernard, the United Pentecostal Church is well known that we are part of the Pentecostal, we'd call it the holiness movement, and we have traditionally stressed the importance of this biblical virtue of modesty. A scripture that we often cite, in fact, you can find it in many of our documents, is 1 Timothy 2, verses 9 and 10, which says, "In like manner that the women adorn themselves in modest apparel, with propriety and moderation, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly clothing, but which is proper for women professing godliness with good works." So my question today is, what does modesty look like in the world we're living in today? How do we apply it to our lives?
Let me focus on modesty, but also make some more general observations. The passage you just read, if you go back one verse to verse 8, so 1 Timothy 2:8, he first addresses the men, and he addresses common temptations that men have to struggle with. And then he says, in like manner also, and then he addresses common temptations that women face. And in this way, it's not denigrating women, but the objective fact that culture has higher expectations on women's appearance. And you can argue that's really more men's fault because they are visually oriented and they try to put their expectations on women. So the reason I'm bringing this out is that Paul makes a gender distinction. He addresses males and females, knowing that we're not identical. We're equal in God's sight. We're equal in value in society, in the home, in the marriage, but we're not the same. And so he addresses different temptations as a generalization, first to men, then to women. But I hasten to add, the principle is the same. So if he says men avoid wrath and doubting, well, if a woman is full of wrath and doubt, well, she should do as well. She should avoid that as well. And then he says, well, women, be sure to dress modestly. Well, if a man is immodest, he should also heed the same thing. So it's not exclusive. So it's not as if we have rules only for women, and some people will say because of cult, it's really the culture that has put more expectations on the woman, which makes a Pentecostal apostolic woman who's trying to follow the Scripture look more easily distinct than a man. Well, that's a problem with our culture. So it's not that we're denigrating women or putting more restrictions on women. It's that our culture has treated men and women unequally. So actually, I would argue we need to treat them equally. And so to me, modesty applies to the man as well as the woman. And it really aggravates me sometimes. I travel, especially in the Middle East, and I will see a Muslim man in a T-shirt and shorts, and his wife is fully covered with from head to toe with only her eyes exposed. And I think, wait a minute, I can respect a person wanting to be modest, although I think that's far excessive. But what really aggravates me, why is only the woman supposed to be modest? It should be equal. And I do think that is true. So modesty in this context, I think, first of all, the root word itself is talking about decent, chaste, not promoting lust of the flesh, which would be desires of your flesh, lust of the eyes, that attraction of the eyes, pride of life, the ego, the self-will of flaunting in yourself. So modesty would mean a decency, basically covering the body, so you're not promoting sexuality or sensuality. And I want to be careful here. I'm not accusing women of causing the problem. If men are lustful, that's their own problem, and I don't blame the woman for that. But I would say both men and women need to be careful. To me, modesty is your demeanor and it's your life. So it's how you talk. If you speak in a risque or vulgar fashion, Ephesians talks about not doing that. That's breaking some barriers that lead, and our society is guilty of this, by joking about things, talking about things that should be only talked about between men and husband and wife, or they're exposing these kind of intimate discussions and secrets and details that should be talked about, if necessary, in a medical or clinical way, or in a group of men in an instructional way, or a group of women, or between a husband and wife, but not just indiscriminately spoken of. So modesty involves your attitude, your behavior, your speech, and your dress. And it involves both men and women. So I think we need to emphasize that. Now, in this context, I find 4 principles. So there is the principle of distinction between male and female. It's addressed here, and even women adorn themselves in modest apparel. The apparel is speaking of a long flowing robe that would be distinctive to women. And even though in ancient times and even today in the Middle East, there are men's robes and women's robes, they're distinctive enough that people can tell the difference from a distance. And even the Old Testament, Deuteronomy 22:5, says there's a distinctively masculine clothing that women shouldn't wear, and vice versa. So I do find the principle of distinction between male and female, or what we sometimes call gender distinction. I find, second, the principle of modesty in the sense of decently covering the body, not exposing it for the purpose of flaunting sexuality or inciting lust. And while you can say, yes, the onlooker is responsible for guarding his own heart, I fully agree with that. Yet at the same time, by our demeanor and our dress, we should not hint or invite or say, I'm wanting to expose myself for sexual attention. And to be honest, many times you just read the advertisements. They say, this is sexy, this is sensual. They're not hiding the fact that, yes, we are deliberately trying to create this kind of thinking. Now, I do want to hasten to say, it says in like manner that women adorn themselves. To adorn means to decorate. So we're not talking about a woman looking plain, ugly, as simple as possible, no type of decor, no ribbons, no colors, no lace, no. And to the contrary, a woman should want to look attractive. A woman should want to look nice. A woman should fix her hair and wear clothes that represent her family, her husband, herself, her church well. And so we're not talking about denigrating or making the woman as plain as possible, but we're just saying, yes, look beautiful, decorate yourself, make yourself attractive, but according to proper guidelines. So modest apparel. So if you want to look attractive, so someone looks at you and says, oh, that's a very nice person, that should be the answer, not, oh, they're a very sensual person, they're a very sexual person, they're showing private organs or hinting at private organs by extremely tight, thin, or skimpy clothes. And so that means to me, a woman's dress should not be excessively low cut. I think a woman's basic torso should be covered, her upper limbs should be covered. When I was a pastor, I always encouraged that a woman should wear a dress or skirt that would cover the knee, whether sitting or standing. And if she's worshiping God, shouting, she's still modest. Now, how do you know exactly what is modest? Well, to some extent, there is a cultural component. So let's say you're in a culture that has expectations, and if you deliberately violate those, you're making a statement. So even if objectively you would say, well, I don't think that's immodest, let's say in Victorian society, for example, or a more conservative society, if you are out of the norm, you are making a statement, even though objectively you may not be exposing too much. In the context of that culture, you're sending a message and they're getting the message. So there is that culture component, but there also has to be an absolute component that regardless of what the culture says. So in our culture, shorts, tank tops, swimming suits, bikinis are all acceptable. But wait a minute. It says, the scripture says, wear modest apparel. Well, if all those things are modest, there is no such thing as immodest apparel, because anything less than that is nothing. So clearly, we can't just go by our culture. Our culture has to be wrong there, because it has no concept that there's any clothing that is immodest. So how do we know what is modest? Well, I think we go back to, is this going to open the door or make us feel like we're projecting, or the onlooker is receiving the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life. And I like to say, okay, maybe wearing a bathing suit is commonly accepted today in certain situations. You go to the beach, nobody thinks anything of it. Nobody's they're not saying, I want to commit adultery. They're not saying, I want to be immodest. But let's be honest, human nature is the same. Human psychology is the same. Human physiology, the way the brain works, the eye works, and the way the male works, the female works, is the same for generations. It doesn't change. So if you interview 10 guys on the beach and say, what is your impression? They're not going to say, well, that's a modest person. They're going to say, that appeals to the lust of the eyes. So you have to be realistic. It's not just what you intend, but what is actually going on. So even though the culture says it's acceptable, even though maybe Christian churches say acceptable, yet the actual effect is still the same as it always has been. Now, another practical way to look at it is, and this is just an example. So if you're looking for hints, well, what would God consider to be immodest? Or what was Paul worried about? In his culture, the women would dress very modestly compared to us. What would he be worried about? So I tried to look at what would be immodest in that culture. They all wore robes down their ankles. They all were covered, their whole bodies, basically. What was he worried about? And what I found is sometimes the women, especially if they're working in the fields or they're doing, some type of activity that requires exercise or exertion, they would pull their robe up above their knee and tie it up above. Well, that was considered immodest. So probably when Paul says, make sure you wear modest clothing, he wasn't saying, don't wear a bikini. That wouldn't have even come to his mind. Don't wear a miniskirt. Don't wear shorts. He would have probably been thinking, you really shouldn't be pulling your robe up above your knee. So first of all, look at what Paul was worried about. And we don't think it's just Paul. We think that's the New Testament church. We think that's the will of God. And so if the New Testament context would consider something immodest, that would be us. We would follow that same guidance. Another example I found of what God might think. So in Isaiah 47, the Lord was bringing judgment, pronouncing judgment upon Babylon and likening her to a woman that's immodest, immoral, and is going to be ashamed. And so he says, Isaiah 47, come down and sit in the dust, O virgin daughter of Babylon. Sit on the ground. There is no throne, O daughter of the Chaldeans, for thou shalt no more be called tender and delicate. Take the millstone, so you're going to be a slave. Grind meal, uncover your locks, make bare the leg, uncover the thigh, pass over the rivers, thy nakedness shall be uncovered, yea, thy shame shall be seen. So God is trying to paint a picture for his people. So this is kind of how God looks at it and also how he expects his people would get the message. So here's this woman that she's ashamed. Her nakedness is exposed. Is he talking about her being nude? No, he's talking about her making bare her leg, uncovering her thigh, and she's walking across the water having to pull up her robe. And he says, that's nakedness, that's shamefulness, that's judgment. And this is a picture of a woman who's disgraced. Well, so are we going to wear those clothes and flaunt? Hey, what God thinks is nakedness and disgrace, we think it's normal. So I think that will give you another example, making bare the leg, uncovering the thigh. So if you're exposing your whole leg and your thigh, God would say that's immodest. That is a shame. So you do get some indications when you read Scripture. So I do think that's a concern. The other thing, modesty also has the connotation of not extravagant, not showy, and you find here in the text moderation. So I would say, I said that first principle is there's a distinction between male and female. Second, the modesty in the sense of decency, what is chaste, what is covering the body, what is not promoting lust. But then there is moderation that you should, and this goes to our whole lifestyle, but also to our dress, that it would be in moderation. So modesty also has that connotation, which is expressed by this other word of moderation. And then it also says not to wear ornamental jewelry, in effect, whether it be in your hair, and I don't think it's talking about simple hair arrangement, but elaborate hair arrangement, or maybe even weaving in ornaments into the hair, as was commonly done in those days. The women in that culture all had long hair, so it wasn't the fact that they had long hair that's actually encouraged, or it wasn't the fact that they fixed up their hair nicely. It was the fact that they tried to be very extravagant, gaudy, or even jewelry in the hair. And so he says, don't wear gold or pearls. I think he's given an example of precious jewels and precious metals, that you should not adorn your body with jewelry that has its only purpose is to draw attention and to be an ornament. So I do see that as avoiding ornamentation, which I would put makeup in the same category. And again, every time makeup is used in the Bible, it's always in a negative connotation of trying to expose yourself, flaunt yourself, attract someone in the wrong way. And although I realize most people today, if they wear jewelry or makeup or even what we consider immodest clothing, they don't intend that. So I'm not attacking them or condemning them, but I'm just saying if we really want to follow the Lord, then the teachings of the New Testament are for the church today, and we should follow those four principles. So I do think modesty encompasses the things I've just mentioned. And what's very interesting, if you study church history, and I explain this, by the way, I have two books, In Search of Holiness and Practical Holiness, and all this teaching is in there. But Practical Holiness actually examines church history. So shockingly enough for some, the early centuries after the Bible, like the 2nd and 3rd centuries, what I've just explained was the common teaching of all so-called Christians, even stricter than what I'm teaching. And then when you see revival movements, so John Calvin, who's the father of the Presbyterian Reform, his teaching was very strict of modesty of dress. John Wesley, the Methodist, his teaching was very strict. The holiness movement of the 19th century, same thing. And then the Pentecostal movement of the early 20th century, by and large, came out of the holiness movement, same thing. So everything I just said would be endorsed by Reformed and revivalist movements of previous centuries, particularly the Calvinist, the Methodist, the holiness people, and the early Pentecostals. So although we're kind of an anomaly today, there are some other groups, but relatively few groups, that still would say this is important. Actually, when you look at church history, our interpretation of Scripture is pretty much the standard and the norm among Bible believers, revivalists, conservative movements. But obviously, at the end of the day, we're not trying to follow even a Pentecostal tradition or a culture. We're trying to follow what the Scripture teaches. And I do believe by actually using the word modesty, it has meaning. And the sad thing is, it looks like many Christian groups never even grapple with what that might mean. But it's not even taught, or it's 100% subjective, or it's irrelevant as ancient culture. But actually, we believe as apostolics that we're part of the New Testament church, and the teachings to that church are to us today.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Apostolic Life in the 21st Century. If you enjoy this podcast, please take a moment to give us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you subscribe to Dr. Bernard's channel, like this video, and leave a comment. We also encourage you to check out Dr. Bernard's books. Visit PentecostalPublishing.com and search for David Bernard to access a full list of titles. Don't forget to enter DKB10 at checkout to save 10% on your order. We look forward to seeing you again next week as we explore how modern-day believers can live out the teachings of the first century church.